fusing your interests with your talents is what gives you the energy to do it again and again and again and again, because anybody who makes things will tell you 90% of making things is shit work, and you do it for the 10% that is literally all you've dreamed about. Literally all you've dreamed about.
For this episode, I sat down with Carl Scott of the Players Tribune, a media platform founded by Derek Jeter that produces first-person stories written by professional athletes. And Carl, our guest, helps those athletes shape the stories, then goes through the meticulous editing and production processes that get those stories out to you.
I listen to people for a living. Supervising audio producer for the Players Tribune. I run anything that is audio-related, podcasts, social stuff, film, but yeah, mostly podcasts.
As of now, those podcasts include the Players Tribune and Knuckleheads, both of which Carl talks about here, along with his foray into radio, the potential of audio as a medium for sharing ideas, some of his thoughts on how to craft a moving story, and more. I met Carl through Ryan Duffy, a journalist, correspondence, producer, and former Jalapeno guest, and immediately was struck by Carl's good nature, his hustle, his love of telling stories, sharing stories about the human condition, the human experience, as a way to better understand ourselves and to connect with each other. I'm very glad to have him as a guest and to let you all know about Carl if you don't yet. Thank you, Carl. Thanks for being on the show. Thanks everybody for tuning in. This is Ty, your host, and here we go with Carl Scott. Thanks for making the time.
Well, thanks for having me, man. I'll be honest with you. Wow, this might be the first podcast I've ever guested on.
Nice.
I only make them.
You make them.
I don't think anyone has ever actually gotten me to be on the show.
Glad to be the first one.
Hey, man.
When we first met, and you were telling me about what you were working on, I didn't realize you were hosting the show that's on Luminary.
Oh, yeah.
And so I started listening to it recently, and I was like, that guy sounds like Carl. And then you're like, this is your host, Carl Scott. And I was like, yeah, hell yeah. It sounds great.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that. That's that was an interesting, a bit of necessity, I would say. I think, making a show that needs to come on weekly, particularly when it's a matter of having athletes telling stories. Well, not really. So for those that are kind of unfamiliar with regard to the show that we're talking about, it's called Players Tribune, the podcast. And the idea essentially is it's the audio version of what we do. So having athletes telling their own stories, getting with our editors to put some stories out that are completely in their voice, and then taking those stories, using that same collateral to actually bring actors in to read those stories has been it's been an interesting endeavor, but to do it weekly is not.
That's crazy.
Yeah, and so it needs to be staffed.
Yeah.
And so thankfully so I kind of have had a little bit of a background doing that kind of content. So I was like, all right, well, let me give it a shot. And I know my schedule, so it's not it's not so hard to wrangle me together to just be like, all right, let me write some scripts up, head in, do some VO, knock it out. So it's been fun. I can't deny it's been fun. It's hilarious because I am relatively quiet in this company, I would say. Somebody else would probably not. But in having that position, doing a show like this puts everybody like, wait, is that Carl? Like, really?
I love that.
You're the guy? Yeah. No, I like it. It's fun.
Yeah. You're like, oh, I got other skills.
I can do some things. The idea is athlete comes in, tells their story, we do a little editing, put a little magic into it, but the athlete always has final say.
Cool.
At all times. So if they want to kill the story at the 1 yard line, goes away. And that in and of itself puts us in a unique position because we are empowering the athlete to work with us and not putting ourselves in a position to be like, I got this deadline I got to hit. I got this number of fans who need to engage in this. I have to extract this from you. It's much more how can we collaborate, or what is it that you have that you're bringing to the table that you need us to assist you in voicing that we can serve that purpose for you.
Yeah. When I was little, one of my best friends' mom had Red Sox season tickets, and so we used to go whenever we could, weeknights or whatever, and we would get there super early so we could watch the warm-ups. And they were playing the Yankees one night, the Red Sox Yanks, and we got there super early, wanted to watch batting practice, and Jeter was taking, I don't know if he was hitting off a tee or getting like lobs, and he was hitting him just right into the backstop. I think he was probably warming up for his batting practice.
Yeah.
And so we weren't, being Red Sox fans, little like middle school wise guys, we weren't necessarily, Jeter wasn't necessarily our favorite player. But it was a good example of him just being a good guy, because we weren't heckling him. We were in awe because we were 2 feet away from one of the best of all time.
Yeah.
And he just looked up and he was like, "What's up, fellas?" And we I don't even think we said anything because we were in shock.
Fanboy out. Right?
Yeah, exactly. And we weren't even his fan, but we were. Once we saw that he was a human and not this, evil empire shortstop, and just a guy, just a nice guy taking BP.
Great guy. That's the thing. The number of people. So I didn't grow up being the biggest baseball fan in general.
Yeah.
But the number of people I've met, they tell you all the time, like, don't meet your heroes. I have not yet met a person whose hero was Derek Jeter, and then they met him and were not blown away by who he was as a human.
That's good enough.
For me, that's part of the foundation of what makes this place work, right?
Yeah.
Like, he is a great guy.
Yeah, it trickles down.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And we're representative of him in a lot of senses.
That's
so
cool.
we want to make sure that we are, putting on in the same way he does.
Yeah. So it sounds like it's a platform for athletes to represent themselves how they want to, not just the traditional media, conventional media kind of celebritizing them and telling, one story or another. Now they get a chance to speak for themselves, essentially.
Exactly, and make sure that they're not misconstrued, that it comes out the way that they
That's
made
great.
it.
I love that. I would have loved that as a kid too, because all we had was Sports Center, which is cool, but you weren't necessarily getting to know the personalities that,
Yeah, no, you're right. You're definitely right. I think, my relationship with sports is very similar in that regard.
Are there any stories particularly memorable for you?
Yeah, probably the story that I most quote is Patrick O'Sullivan, a hockey player. I can't remember what team he played for, but he did a piece called Black and Blue, and it's just a brilliant conception. So the idea of it basically is he grew up with a really abusive dad, and he talked about the fact that, his dad might, like, if he messed up during practice, his dad might smack him up in the parking lot, and then people would see it. He'd do it in public, and his reaction to that kind of abuse was to stay on the ice. And so his whole conception was basically to say to his father, like, I know because I am a professional hockey player, 2 things get misconstrued. From a public perspective, the people who saw you abuse me, they think that that's what it takes to be the best. From your perspective, you think that that's what it takes to be the best. And I'm here to tell you in particular, I'm only good because I tried to stay away from you. That was my haven. I just stayed there, so I just put in more and more hours because being around you and knowing that what I was going to have to endure being close to you was just not the move. And it's not that he doesn't have love for his dad. His dad still, like, comes to the games and all of that, but there's just, like, a very poignant conversation there. Like, I had never really thought about it in that perspective, right? Because you look at that when you see elite athletes, you're like, wow. Like, and then you see them going through something that's tough. It's like, oh, that's what's going to make them so tough that they can, like, put up with anything and, like, make it to the most elite level. And to hear somebody at that level be so blatant about, like, no, I did this kind of myself. You were, but people can internalize it that way.
Right.
They can feel that, if I wasn't this tough on you, you would never be able to make it. But his idea of, like, no, I totally do not agree with that. And if you're beating your kid or you watch somebody beating their kid in the parking lot, say something. Like how many of these, some of my friends' parents could have, like, interjected there. And that's the thing. We also have a lot of those things going on in our society, these ideas of like privacy, which I respect, you know, but that notion of like, I can't.
There's a line.
Yeah, exactly. I can't stand idly by. I just really, that story stuck with me the moment that I read it, and I just cannot shake it loose. It's one of my favorite stories we've ever done here.
Wow. I'll have to check it out. We'll include a link to that in the show notes.
A thing for me, and I think that happens in a place like Players Tribune, you get to prove out this notion that the story is the most important thing. So, yes, the celebrity matters in certain senses, but when the story is great, who we're talking about just doesn't, you know. Yeah. But a lot of the times that celebrity is used to kind of entice you. I got to walk you in the door, right, to get this story. But the reality is, like, when it's a great story, I know that Players Tribune has made a tremendous amount of successes telling stories of athletes that not very many people have an idea who they are.
I mean, that's another service too, is humanizing all of them, not just the Derek Jeters.
And because they're all humans. I mean, it's such an easy it's an easy proposition.
Yeah, cool. And so speaking of stories and telling good stories, one of the things that I'm interested in talking to you about with your depth of experience and when you're thinking about stories, particularly putting them out every week across multiple shows and wanting to only put out quality. How do you think about that?
Oh, that's a good question. Putting out
or what makes a good story in general? Maybe we could start there.
One, your personal curiosity. My interest is paramount.
Yeah. That's like the first step. You have to be.
Yeah, it has to matter to me. It definitely has to. I mean, as the storyteller, if you're the person who's, and not necessarily that I'm actually telling the stories, but ushering the stories into the world, they should be interesting. Like off the bat, interesting. And they should be stories. I mean, the hardest thing to get, particularly in the podcast industry, this happens so much. This idea of kind of talking around things, but not acknowledging the fact that like something needs to happen. I need to start in one scene and I need to progress into another scene. Like there has to be a yarn spun in order to get me from point A to point B. And really being, I would say, a vigilante about that, like not settling for less with regard to like that story just has to like
pace.
The pacing has to be. If we get into pacing, that's a whole. That's so where we're going, which I hadn't really like discussed, but that's the world of like how that works, particularly in audio. The pacing it matters in pretty much every medium. I can only really speak for audio, but I know as a person who works in a medium that you cannot see during a time period where everybody wants to look at the things that they engage in, that it's incumbent upon me as a storyteller to maximize the things that audio can do that other mediums cannot. Like someone who knows what they're doing with audio can compress time and extend time in a way that is just like, it is magic to me. I can, when you do it right, I can make 30 seconds feel like 5 minutes or vice versa. And those kinds of things pull you in a way. And then you also, as an audio storyteller, you're trying to match, you're trying to match or at least spark the imagination. Listening to podcasts to me is the closest thing to reading a book. And that engagement is very particular. If you're reading a book, you can tell in the first like 25 pages whether or not you give a shit about this book at all or not. And I feel the same way with a tremendously more compressed amount of time with podcasts. If I got about 30 seconds, 60 seconds before you do not care at all. So how can I get to the emotional space or get you engaged or caring about who this person is who's speaking to you without being sappy, without being trite or you know, pushing you? Because I'm also super sensitive, particularly to like how scoring plays part and how easy it is in certain senses to just like pull heartstrings. Cause a sad song. I think I should be sad right now. Like those kinds of cues shouldn't be so blatant. But when I'm thinking about putting together stories, like those things are, have you given me enough raw material to let that shine? And how vulnerable are you?
Yeah.
That's kind of quintessential.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about the human condition here. So what you're expressing needs to feel in some way like something that I've gone through or something that I might be able to go through. I'm keep going back to this Patrick O'Sullivan article because it's in that. That's the feeling. I'm like, I've definitely been in situations where, I've seen kids get kind of beat by their parents right there in front of me. And then you're in this weird, should I engage? Should I not? To have somebody like,
right.
Hey, I'm going to stand up and put my hand up for that kid that you watched.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yes, it is just my experience, but here's an opinion that you might not have considered.
Right. And then to hear it from the source, in this case, Patrick O'Sullivan, immediately sparks compassion because you're rooting for him and you know that he went through it. And now you can relate his experience to everyone else's experience that has had that happen to them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And so, that for me, how much of yourself are you? Because when you sit in front of a microphone, and the more I sit in front of this microphone is, depending on how you chop this thing up, the beginning of this interview was not that great because I'm super nervous speaking in front of microphones, weirdly enough. But with more time, you become more of yourself. And I don't think that the voice can lie in the same senses that you can do it visually. So it's a big thing for me with when I make stuff, no matter what kind of pods they are. I purposefully have groups of people in my circle who I play content for who don't care about the concept, may not be a sports fan, any of those things, and I'll play them, and then people will come back and say, well, I don't listen to pods, I don't really know what critique to give you. Like, just tell me when you stopped caring.
Yeah.
That's all that matters. Because my job is to hook you and make sure that you continuously care from front to back.
Yeah.
And that really is kind of like my litmus test in a lot of senses, because that's the reality. For me, it is very hard from a podcast perspective. If you're listening if you're listening to audio, you can't fake being bored.
Right.
It's such a passive medium. You can do other things, and the moment that you'll find yourself like drifting off, and you'll be like, oh, wait, what did they just say? I might have to rewind that. It's the same thing happens with books, right? You'll just find yourself like you just missed 3 paragraphs of some shit, and you're like, oh, I got to go back because I don't have a clue why I'm here right now. And you realize like that to me is more what I need. I need the innate response because that's my job. To me, that's when I'm doing my best job, when the Players Tribune as an organization is doing the best that they can do. It is so compelling that you get lost in it.
Yeah.
And that experience people take with them. The Players Tribune podcast, I think, is very much, the sound design is created such that I'm trying to compel you to walk into this story and live with this story in a way that's much more like I am making a movie that you can't see.
Yeah, exactly.
And hopefully, if I did it right, you are compelled emotionally the exact same way that you might have been compelled if you read it the first time, because that's the thing. I think part of it for me is like these stories are so good, and this is just a great opportunity to let people hear them and engage with them a second time. It's just like some of these stories, it's funny to kind of like look at them on the back end, because right before they go out, I generally send a copy of the episode to the original editor who worked with the athlete. Like everybody kind of gets the athlete gets to know, everybody kind of gets an idea of like, oh, this is coming out. And the kind of feedback, the kind of like response that people have to be like, wow, that was deep. I mean, I had this one moment with Tommie Harris, defensive tackle for the Bears. Let me pull out my phone and make sure that that's the position that he lineman. I think he was a tackle though. Yep. Got it right. Nice. Yeah. Tommie's a good dude. I'm a very, very big fan of Tommie. And he told a very compelling story that he wrote with us about losing his wife to a brain aneurysm during a routine cosmetic surgery. She was getting breast reduction. And I met Tommie. We had already had a lot of conversations. We were working on a whole other concept for a podcast, and I really wanted to use his story as a pilot to kind of understand whether or not what we were doing, this idea of having actors come in to read stories might work. And we got Harry Lennox, who actually is one of the leads on the show, The Blacklist, came in and read the story. And once we sound designed it, I actually sent it back to Tommie. And Tommie, literally, he asked me, he was like, dude, how did you know? I'm like, what do you mean? Because there is a moment where it takes place in a hospital room. Mm-hmm. And so I'm bringing in some of the sound design of a breathing machine, like the heart monitor, all those kinds of things. And he was like, dude, I listened to this thing and it took me to that place. Oh, wow. Like, it freaked me out because it took me, like, you like rekindled a memory. And I was like, for me, it was a double-edged sword, right? Because for me, I'm also walking this very thin line of like, I am approximating what I feel when I read it. Yeah. So I don't know if I'm accurate, which is part of the reason why I want you to hear it so that I know. Yeah. But to have that kind of reaction, right? That's the thing that I feel about when the emotion is raw and you feel like that, you can't remove that. Like, people walk away with such a like an experience. That's really what I feel that the Players Tribune, the podcast, is. It's an experiential kind of concept. Mm-hmm. To me, like, it's the kind of thing that if you don't know anything about podcasts, you should just try, because it exemplifies some of what can be done with a reasonable amount of resources, a great story, and a little bit of an imagination. I think it does a tremendous amount of representing what it is that we do on an everyday basis, just in a new medium for a new set of fans, and hopefully walks them in to be like, wow, like, is it what you gotta do? Yeah. I can just go on the website and read 100 of those? Shit, like, sign me up.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier it was rewarding. I imagine it's cathartic for the athletes who get to tell these stories, particularly the two that you've referenced are, painful memories. Yeah. To be able to kind of tell the world what it was like. And then if you can capture that with your sound design and word choice and artistry, then it relieves some of the pain, or at least is a chance for them to express themselves in a different way.
Yeah. Yeah. I can't speak directly for it. I do a lot, particularly for like that show is all previously written content, and I'm the pod guy. I don't write what I mean? But yes, I am sure of it, that having those experiences, and we've seen it over and over again with Kevin Love, and for many people who've kind of come in and used our platform as a just like an open space to share something that they've not shared with the world previously. Right. The response is really the thing. When people are coming back tremendously supportive, and when you feel like you've kind of been vulnerable to the world, particularly when, and I'm approximating a lot of this stuff because I'm not an athlete, but when you are placed in a position to, I can't say generally be distrustful of people, but in a lot of senses, to then share yourself in a way that is probably the most vulnerable that you've done in a public sense for a while, and have everyone's like gather around you is, it has to be, super empowering. I think that's the thing. I think if I can sum up what it is that we do here in that one word, it is that empowering situation. We want to make sure, and I love it just on a human level. Sports aside, on a just direct human level, during a time period in human history where, people are really battling to be sure that they have their desires acknowledged. Yeah. To give people that space to like, no, talk your shit. That's what this is for. Yeah.
Yeah. That's why everyone has a podcast.
Kind of true. Super true.
There's a lot going on here. You're managing a bunch of shows. I'm curious also, as an outsider peeking in and producing my show, is how do you stay on top of it all? Like, what does it take to do it well as a producer?
a tremendous amount of patience and organization. Organization. The more shows you have, the more bodies moving around to execute against them, the more time you need to take to make sure that all that stuff is being done appropriately. The reality is, particularly for a place like the Players Tribune, what we do is not easily replicable. So there always has to be TPT DNA on the things that we make. There needs to be somebody who's been here, knows how this place works, to kind of make sure that the magic dust is on our content. So with that being said, there's a lot of freelancers, just bringing, people who have the skill set come into the room, but we have to make sure that, the authenticity of what makes our content work is sprinkled on everything that goes out of the door here. But the organization that's for me, and that's something that I've just learned. It's not like I've been sitting around here managing, all these podcasts forever. It's just something that I've learned with time of getting ahead of things, just putting yourself in a position to know when something needs to be delegated and when you need to touch it, because that's another hard part for me. I'm a creator's creator. I like making things, so it gets tough when my job is a lot more about the delegation of the making of things and being sure that you bring in the right team such that you feel very confident that they can execute against the vision in a way that's authentic and keeps the value of what you're doing at the level you need it to be.
And not to mention just the objective project management and calendar management. And I imagine you gotta
pub schedules. I mean, the thing about making pods is it is very creative, but it is very technical. Like this we're still in a world of we're not that far away from broadcast medium. So, when you're on deadline, this stuff got to be mixed. And some of the things for us is we make podcasts that are as convenient for the athletes as possible. So take Knuckleheads, for example. We travel wherever we have to go, record in some of the most precarious places all over the country. And so some of those things are crazy. Like we did a interview with Cappie Pondexter, WNBA retired. She just recently retired from Chicago. Shouts out. And we were in a hotel, and where were we? Was that Cali? That had to be California. And the hotel had this very weird, modern art installation where there were two different buildings that were east and west from the hotel, but they were connected by this art installation with just a bunch of wires that were connected to the side of the building. So we start the conversation, and all of a sudden I hear, and I'm like, what the hell is that? And I look out the window, and that whole thing is just rocking back and forth in the wind. Oh no! So it just ruins the sound. But then you got to do all of this back in post-production to kind of get that stuff out of there. Right. It's tremendously technical, and there's a lot of things that you're gonna encounter the more of these things you do. I would say that you're going to encounter a lot more oddities. I would say I might be in a particular situation that is not traditional. I feel like most people who do podcasts, it's such a simple setup. They can find a quiet space and that's just it. But when you're dealing with, people who have some level of celebrity, you're in some odd places because it's most comfortable to them. Right. And nobody who makes these things, particularly if they don't have any idea about what it goes into making a podcast, is thinking about how to make the space that you're recording in soundproof or that kind of stuff. Those considerations they just go out of the window. So it's a lot more of going with the flow, showing up where you have to, but making sure, because the comfort is key, right? These guys aren't comfortable, the story didn't come. So whatever you need, I got you. Don't worry about it. I'll take care of the rest. We'll work it out. And so that's been a big part of juggling, I would say, because those technical issues are important, because once this hits the world, And that's my favorite thing about podcasts, particularly sports fans. They're going to tell you that it's shit when they feel that way. You know, they're not going to like hold back. They really aren't. And so you find your way, but you learn your lessons, you make adjustments, you make it better. You just make sure that the quality stays at a level that it can't, you know.
Definitely. Yeah. And the comfort, I mean, it speaks to what you were saying earlier about being vulnerable and being yourself, and how even I've done a handful of these interviews, but it's still, it's rarely as natural as a conversation that's not being recorded.
Yeah.
And but the goal is to get there, and usually it starts happening after a little while. But it requires both people being comfortable and willing to just kind of shoot the breeze for a little while and be vulnerable together, so you can ideally forget that it's being recorded. Because the best conversations, I'm sure, I don't know if this is true for you, it's true for me, are, you know, late night with a friend, or when you're not self-conscious about being recorded.
Yeah, and that's the thing. And sometimes it just takes time. Like, I honestly, I mean, if we had 2.5 hours to have this conversation, the second half would be fire. Yeah. No doubt. No doubt in my mind. But I see that also with, you know, some of the shows that I've worked on. You have to kind of let people work it out. But there's also a world of whether or not you have it in the first place. I don't want to disregard the fact that interesting is interesting, right? Yeah. There's still people out here making podcasts who you're just not that interesting.
Right,
I mean, but the cream rises to the top.
Exactly.
I mean, I think that's just, I would say, keenly aware and excited by that part of the creative process. Can I make something that is good enough to stay there and give these athletes a platform to be like, holy shit, like, you guys really care about what I have to say. Like, yes. That's a wonderful thing to be able to kind of, you know, it's a challenge, but to do it in mass is it's a difficult undertaking. It's kind of odd too, I won't lie. It's just like, for me, because I've worked my way into this position, and now that I'm here, I really enjoy like everything that I'm doing. But the notions of like, over time, I've been able to key in very quickly on, oh, that's something people are going to care about. Yeah, I don't know necessarily about that, but part of it is whether or not I can see the demographic, because that's really, at the end of the day, to me, one of the things that people miss when they make podcasts, particularly, is who am I making this for? Like, if you haven't answered that question, answer it first. Like that kind of thing. People like to do the like, oh, I hang out with my friends, and you know, we text back and forth, and we're really hilarious texting, and I think I should turn that into a show. Maybe. But I mean, for who? For you and the two friends that you do it for? Like that kind of thing. And then really being able to kind of take that idea of like, oh, I actually see a considerable number of people who are already into this. This person explains it in such a wonderful way, or gives them access in a way that they will never be able to get otherwise. And this is what we're presenting, so that we know very clearly this is the group, and this group is either going to love it or hate it, and we'll be able to expand outward and not saying, oh, I'm making a basketball show. Who's it for? Everybody who loves basketball. That's too wide. You can't find out if it worked or not when you take those kinds of approaches.
Yelling out a window, as that's exactly how you described it.
Exactly what it is. This is what I thought. That's what I've always to this day considered Twitter to be. It's like standing out on 42nd Street and yelling out a window. That every once in a while somebody might look up at you, you know, and be like, "Oh, were you talking to me?" No, okay, and then they walk off. But most of the time, traffic's just flowing, and it's definitely like that. Like making shows, making podcasts in particular in this environment is a lot like that. You're just kind of like, "Hey, I got something to say. Does anybody care?" But when you're much more, what's the word I want to use?
Pointed.
In your approach.
So I think this is helpful for people listening, because it's not just for a podcast, but if you're trying to get anything out into the world, you want to be dialed in terms of who you're trying to convince or to persuade, or even just to look your way. So can you give us an example of like how you think about an audience for, say, Knuckleheads? Like, what was your...
So the Knuckleheads approach actually was a mix both of basketball, 100%, but also being culturally sensitive. The thing I think that makes Knuckleheads work is that Quentin Richardson and Darius Miles are, as Darius would call them, culture pushers. So they are. Have you ever listened to the song "Middle Child" by J. Cole?
No.
So the whole premise of that song is him talking about he's sitting in the middle of the hip hop industry where he kind of can look to like the Nas's and the Biggies of the world, and I studied them and now I know who I am. But I also have like the Kodak Blacks and those guys who are much younger than me. I can give them a little bit of advice. Yeah. So when you look at Quentin and Darius in the context of generational basketball, they're like dead center. And because of that, they're like not too old, that the young kids don't think they're cool. They're not too young, that the old guys don't respect them.
So a unique perspective and access that other people don't.
Exactly. They have a particular spot in the culture, but they're also very, like, they come from impoverished environments, very similar to the one I come from. Like, they're literally from around my way. Like, I'm from Chicago, Q's from Chicago. Darius is from East St. Louis. Like, I know that space. And so they represent kind of an everyman of sorts that I could see so clearly. And so then it became a much more easy way for me to be like, all right, this is kind of like if I were to say it, I think it's like the probably grown man. I got a child, but I grew up on hip hop music. I love basketball. So the thing that works with those guys though is like, because they have their own perspective, they are able to bring in, like, we got Kevin Durant, we got Dwayne Wade, we got the guys who like walk a lot of the younger fans into the door. But another point that I would make in terms of like how I could see so clearly who the audience was, I actually used D himself as a demographic point. So when I met him, I asked him, hey, you know, what pods do you listen to? And he's like, I don't really listen to pods. The ones that I do listen to, I got from YouTube, which were Drink Champs and Joe Budden. And my biggest thing, like, before we even started to go down this route of making this show, the show that I wanted to make, and I don't know if you've ever heard of it, it was called Combat Jack. And it was by this guy who's basically one of the first hip-hop lawyers, interestingly enough, named Reggie Ose. He passed away relatively recently. And that show was like an oral history show. That's all they did. They just like got Big Daddy Kane on for like 3 hours to just tell all the craziest stories and talk through his entire life. And I was like, that's the show. I want to make the basketball version of that show. Okay. Just all the stories. I don't care about pundits. You guys don't talk to me about the playoffs. I don't care what's going on in, you know, current basketball in the sense of like, did you see the game yesterday? More like generationally, we used to do this, we can't do this anymore, those kinds of conversations. And so when I met D, and he told me that the first time he had ever heard any of those pods, it didn't include it didn't include Combat Jack, but the other references that I had were Joe Budden's pod, Drink Champs by Noriega. And so he was like, oh, I got those shows, and I got those shows on YouTube. So eventually I was like, oh, you're the guy. So if I make this show for you and I put it only on audio, you're never going to listen to it, even if it's literally everything that you want, which I know that it can be. So we have to film this. We have to put it on video because the demographic that I'm actually aiming toward probably does not know how to get a pod. You have to start to also like seed your content in the places where people are just naturally congregating. That's a big thing for pods in general. I think anybody who's made pod for a considerable amount of time will just tell you that. I'm sure you know it. It's like, where are you? I just need to know where you are, and then I'm just going to go show up there rather than trying to, once again, scream out the window and get you to come upstairs. Like that, this is not fishing like that. It's just so hard to do. So it was much more aimed at the African-American, the Latino audience, to particularly the urban audience, to make sure like these are city kids, these are like sneaker wearing guys. Like there's like a world to it. It's kind of aggressively male, though we are doing our our due diligence to stop that. You know what I mean? Like, it definitely was not a purposeful thing. That's why we got Cappy. Shouts to her. I'm so glad we did. Like, we're really trying to like make sure that everybody knows that it's just good vibes. My biggest thing about that show and my love for that show is exactly that those guys do not play in the world of doing gotcha moments. They only play in this idea of like, we're just here to celebrate you. You're dope. The world knows you're dope. Just tell your stories. We'll like go back and forth with you, and then we'll go home. And it's just such a great thing.
So when you're pitching it, like before you started making the show, you say on some level you want to have a geographical understanding of who might be listening. You want to have a demographic understanding of who.
Right. You want a
and
cultural
then you want a cultural. Or Seth Godin, I've heard him say you want a sociographic or a psychographic versus a demographic. So it's like, what are these people thinking about? You want to sort of define your audience that way. What do these people care about? People like us do things like this. So in this case, people are living in this type of
area,
environment.
They wear these kinds of clothes. They listen to this kind of music.
They will also like Knuckleheads.
Yes, because we are representative of all those things across the cultural spectrum.
That's cool.
To make sure that you know that this is for you. That's the thing. All the cues are there. We just got to find out where you are so that we can show up there. And I am pretty confident that when you do it right, that's how people feel when they engage it. Like, holy shit, you made this show for me. Like, this is the show I've been waiting for. And so it's a little bit of alchemy in there to pull it off. But I'm very grateful that we were able to get it right. And it's definitely the kind of thing that we can do more of and are aiming to do more of.
That's one thing I've struggled with the show, is not really being able to define it. Other than that, it's people who interest me and people who have a lot of spirit behind the work that they do, people who really care about their work. And so that way, and that is an example of like people who like basketball. Like it's still too broad, but I started it knowing much less than I do now about what it would become. And now looking back in retrospect, each of the guests has been someone who is like got an interesting personality, really cares about their work, sort of marching to their own drummer, and willing to work really hard to actualize their vision or whatever it is they care about. Man. And then there's kind of open-ended conversations like the ones that we're having, but
it's working. It's working. I've listened to your show. I enjoy it. It is working.
So.
I mean, I feel grateful to be able to be on it because I'm thankful that you have been able to see that in terms of the conversations that we have about, my approach to the work, because it very much is like I'm not a naturally, like, I love sports, but I'm not like a fanatic in that sense. So I come from a storytelling background. I come from a very musical background. So even my approach to production is very like, it's avant-garde, I would say, in terms of like how I like to lay these things out and make these stories into what I need them to be. And I love my job, man. I really do.
Amen. So, speaking of your background, how did you first get into it? Because you were at StoryCorps. What happened before that?
Before that, I got my degree in information systems, so I was a tech guy for a lot of years, and radio was just something that I did on the side just to like dabble in.
Sounds familiar.
I just because it was one of those things where it's like I couldn't figure out, and this is 10 years ago, 10 plus. So there was no podcast industry to speak of. Like, it wasn't a thing.
What initially hooked you, or what caught your ear, I guess?
I actually heard, and this is cliche because I feel like everybody in my generation who makes radio feels this way. I listened to This American Life, and I was just I was like, oh, I want to do that. Because my biggest thing when I started making radio was I want to hear myself. Not necessarily me as a person, but people who are like me. I never heard them on the radio. Not in the like NPR, newsy, intellectual space. Like, there was no like young black men, running that space. Particularly like hip hop infused young black men. Because for me, very much, if you come from a culture, I'm 38. If you come from a culture like mine, we didn't listen to hip hop. We were hip hop. It was a very much like, this is my persona. And so I never saw that. So I was very big on like trying to figure out how to represent that part of my culture en masse. And so over that time, StoryCorps was just the biggest lesson that I got in how to listen. And that's a very big thing in terms of like hosting or any of this kind of engagement in the creation of a podcast. To me, you really have to spend some time and learn how to like engage another human being and listen and understand when they are interested and when they're not. Another big thing when you talk to me about like how to bring some of these stories forward, I'll sit with an athlete or any guest for a good minute until I see them lean forward.
Yeah.
It's the same thing people who make films will tell you that when they like go to the theater to watch people watch their movies, they're waiting for somebody to like shift in their seat to engage it, you know, like, and that's
something cracks open.
That's the thing I want out of you. And once I get that, now that's the line. And I may like the thing that I may want as far as the story is concerned, maybe on the other side of the world from the thing that just made you interested, but we got to start with where you're interested. Like, there's no way to like, people like to play that game of like, you know, you ask the question and you kind of veer somebody in one direction and you're like, like people feel used when you're doing shit like
exactly.
You know, and it's definitely not about that. It's like, this is for you. So, you know, from my perspective, it's very much about like chasing interest. Like if I know that that's what you're interested in, all right, well, let's go there, because now we're going to have an authentic conversation and we'll find our way there. You know, I think Knuckleheads also benefits from it, because those guys sit down and they're like, hey, no gotcha questions. So we're not here for any of that. And then they get these guys so comfortable, the dudes will come out and say some like, oh, well, wait a minute, wait. We're actually not here for that. Like all good vibes. We don't need any of that extra. But
I feel like sports too is classic. There's this classic sideline interviews where the interviewer is asking questions and the athlete answers, and then it's almost as if they're in two different worlds, because you can tell that the person who asked the question isn't even like, doesn't care what they said. It's on to the next question, and then it lasts about 10 seconds anyway, and it's like, what was that?
Exactly. How do we get here? That's the piece you're always trying to avoid, man. I just don't, you know, doing this work is definitely like giving me a lot more, particularly coming from the space that I came from. I think getting into this world was me first wanting to, I guess, you're young, you're selfish, you want to like, oh, give me a microphone, let me talk, I'm interesting. And extending out from that into having a literal like job where I didn't talk and all I did was listen, to then understand how, one, when you do that and you do that in mass for a long period of time, you get the like, how I put we used to say the 3 T's. That's what we say in StoryCorps: trials, tribulation, triumph. Everybody is telling some version of that story. There's just a million combinations and permutations of that story. But you start to get an understanding of the actual human condition. And then when you kind of fuse that with your own personal interests, all kinds of crazy stuff can kind of happen. But that also, I will say, you know, for anybody endeavoring, one, to be a storyteller, also in the podcasting world, fusing your interests with your talents is what gives you the energy to do it again and again and again and again. Because anybody who makes things will tell you 90% of making things is shit work. And you do it for the 10% that is literally all you've dreamed about. Literally all you've dreamed about. And so that is, I don't know, for me is definitely that. Like I sit around being like, I can stand the grind because I took the things that I've learned and I matched them with the things that I care about. Now we're off to the races.
And you know what you're aiming for. You know that feeling that you're aiming for.
Exactly. And that feeling works. It's just, I think the trickiest part of it is how to express that feeling to a lot of people. That's the thing. I mean, we're all of us in podcasting and business in general, right? It's about finding that audience, that mass. So I think the trickiest part of the whole entire job is how to bottle it and then give it to the people who you know want it.
I mean, there's so many places to fall short. It's so easy to think that your idea, whether you're trying to make it into a show or a movie or a book or not, you have something that's interesting to you, and you kind of assume that other people will think it's interesting. But the work to be done, let alone all the objective work to be done, the thinking work to be done is how do you then present that in a way that could make the other person feel your enthusiasm.
Exactly. And that's a big thing I would say too. It's weird because I have people in my life who say this about me, like, if I'm excited about something, you're gonna get excited about it, because not even that I won't shut up. I just talk with like crazy enthusiasm, and I'm like all over the top with it, and that it can be used in the wrong way in certain senses, but that part of it, like being a person who can be compelling in terms of like how you tell your own stories, allows you to kind of see that in other people, because that's the thing. I sat with Quentin and Darius, and I was like, there's no way this doesn't win. There's no way this doesn't win. Like, you guys are yourselves, and you're willing to go there if I ask you to. Because there are moments where I really want them to be a little bit more vulnerable than they might normally be. But I'm like, this is gonna work. Don't worry, it's gonna work. Yeah. And it's that I think there's a that innate part of athletes to be like showmen and showwomen. When you have that talent and you put that hard work behind it, and you've put those blessed ways, I'm showing off. Why not? That's the thing. I say that all day. I'm like, the universe knew what was going on, not making me 6'4". Oh my God. Yeah. I wouldn't know what to do with myself if I was. Stop it.
That's hilarious. So I want to go back just a second. So you wanted to get into it initially because you felt like the world you were from, the person that you were, and your comrades did not have a voice in the public sphere other than the music, through the musical icons.
Yeah, that was the thing. We were rappers, we were athletes.
Yeah,
I never saw that in public radio, and that's just me being a nerd kid. I mean, and granted, I do feel as a kid who grew up in hip hop music, if you were in an inner city, hip hop was a way by which you got to be weird. Because for the most part, all these communities are and I can't say, I don't want to be that presumptuous, but they're heterogeneous in a lot of ways. Like, you just stay here. This is what you're gonna do. Like, don't, it's hard for you to get outside of circles when you're like growing up in those kinds of environments. Yeah. So hip hop was the place where you're like, oh, you want to dance? Here's a place for you to dance. You want to be an artist? Here's a place for you to be an artist. Cool. You like poetry, you could be a weird kid. And so I always like embraced that, because that was a way by which I got to kind of like express my weirdness in the place that was very much like, how do I even put that? Like, that was the place where you can do it, particularly as a boy, and not have to be seen as weak or any of those, like, because people don't, also is a whole other conversation, right? When we start getting into all of this, like, macho, how manhood actually works, particularly in, and I don't even think it's just areas like where I came up in. Like, I think a lot of men are coming up in those spaces where there's some version of, this is how you need to behave in order to kind of be engaged as a man. Right. And so that was one of the places where I found hip hop to be a loophole, because people thought rappers were cool, and I could be like kind of in that world, but not have to like be tough, right? Because I just wasn't that dude. So I always found my way around, like, using my humor, using my personality, and plus I was a tiny kid. Like, I didn't grow. By the time I was in high school, I was still like 95 pounds at 4'11". I was a little guy. So I found other ways about who I was as a person to like project me forward. And then, because I rapped all my life, like, all that stuff kind of like came to a head when I actually got exposed to, like, when I remember the first episode that I ever listened to of This American Life was about this fireman was telling a story about chasing he got a call from this couple at this house, and they had a squirrel in their house, and he had to go get it out. Yeah. But I think he might have been a policeman. But the whole story was so hilarious, because it was in their attic, and he climbed up in the attic, and then the thing like literally like attached to his face and ran down his body, chased it down in the living room, and he was trying to get it out of, it was like under a couch, I think. And somehow, basically, he backed it into a space where it like went into their fireplace and kind of got caught on fire, and then like shot out like a fireball under their couch.
A flaming squirrel.
And the couch starts smoking. It was like a cartoon. It was the greatest story. I was like, oh my God, I want to do this. I just want to tell stories like this, or have people tell me stories like this. Yeah. And for me, it was much more like, it was a representative thing. It was just kind of like, no, I want my jargon involved. I want to speak the way that I speak. Yes, I went to boarding school. Don't get it twisted. I actually went to boarding school in Massachusetts. I went to Carnegie Mellon University. I have a very traditional high level of education, but I like the way I talk.
Yeah.
And I want
Yeah.
other, particularly young people, to look out and see, oh shit, that's me.
Right.
That's me. That's what Knuckleheads is to me. Oh, that's me.
Yeah.
I could do that.
Yeah.
And everybody has that representative. Like, everybody has a space where they're like, no, if I'm being my full authentic self, there's a whole group of people who really rock with that.
Yeah.
And all I need to do is just find them.
Heck yeah. Yeah. That's so cool. That's a beautiful thing about what you saw in This American Life and what you hope to do with Knuckleheads and the shows that you're making is a mirror. It's an expansion of what you saw or what you felt through hip hop when you're, growing up in your neighborhood, and you say, oh wait, I can express myself. Look, Nas is cool and he expresses himself. Exactly. And now I can. Yeah. And now I don't have to be this singular version of whatever being a tough guy meant.
Right. Or a fake version of that whole thing, kind of living in that world. Like, we all find our ways, right? That's my thing. I feel like you grow up in any space, no matter what it is. It's a matter of making whatever talent that you were just given match some level of how it works, so you can push it into a space that you can open up an opportunity for yourself. Yeah. And I think, weirdly enough, my talent is running my mouth. I'm a very quiet person, but I think that my talent is like telling stories and expressing myself in some creative fashion. That's always been It's always been my thing. So
and you have conviction. You can feel your conviction.
And that's the thing. If I'm quiet, I don't care. Mm-hmm. If I care, I'm loud.
Yeah.
And that's and to me that's part of like how you get a good story. I need to figure out what you care about and then just give you a platform to scream it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you can get it. It's super cathartic. Right. It is. It really is.
It's really cool. And it's fun to think about the fact that because there are so many good stories out there and more coming out, is that young people in particular, or even people who had maybe never considered a alternative approach or alternative perspective on things, now can say, oh, I just heard this story on This American Life or on Knuckleheads or fill in the blank show, and say, wait, I could think about things like that, or maybe I'm more like that person than I am about this person I thought I was like. And then now all of a sudden your whole world is broadened, and that's a beautiful thing.
Hit the nail on the head, man. I think that's something also that I feel is very important in having this position, particularly with an organization like this, is like expressing myself in such a fashion that other people can look, people who are like me or not, who are outside of the podcasting world, and being like, I kind of want to do it. I don't really know. Like, you can do it, man. And you don't have to sacrifice who you are in order to do it. To me, if you are doing a tremendous amount of sacrifice of who you are, it might not be your thing.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's don't get it twisted. I feel like this job is kind of the one that taught me that.
Yeah.
Before that, I think it's kind of, you're generally that person trying to figure out how can I be who you need me to be?
Right.
But this is the first place where, it's just been a tremendous amount of success that I feel from, talking my shit everywhere.
Right. Yeah. Through the process, you figure out more specifically what it is that you care about, what it is that interests you, and you sort of refine your tastes as you go.
Yeah, exactly.
The more work, which requires work.
Exactly. And just don't give up on it, man. Just keep at it.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a fun thing to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't want to take up your whole evening, but there's one more thing I want to cover if you have time.
I got about 10.
10, perfect.
Cool.
So, and it is related to advice, what you've learned, sort of what you wish you knew when you were starting. But the last time we spoke, you mentioned when you're trying to learn anything, there's 3 steps. You got to get your books on it. You got to subscribe to the magazine, and you can find a mentor.
Yeah.
And so I thought that was helpful for me. So maybe you could just kind of talk about that
story. Yeah. So this is when I was working for StoryCorps, actually. So I can't take full credit for this. A pilot, black pilot. Why I'm telling you he's black is inconsequential. I don't know why I did, but anyway. He and his daughter were in the back in the booth telling stories, and for some reason they had both kind of taken to me, because when you go into the booth to record for StoryCorps, 2 people are sitting kind of at a table, as it were, and then there's always a facilitator, someone who's either there to like throw a question or 2 out, but for the most part just managing the recording, letting people know 5 minutes left, 2 minutes left, what have you. And the daughter looked at me and she was like, Daddy, tell Carl how to learn anything. What's the process of learning anything? And he laughed and he's looking at me. He's like, you want to know? I'm like, of course. I mean, how to learn
It's
anything?
the Holy Grail, yeah.
What? And he's like, and it's still super true to this day. It's like you go to the library and you get the most basic Fisher-Price, my first what have you of that industry humanly possible. It's podcasting. I need these absolute basics, ABCs of it. You read that book from front to back. Now you got the basics. Then you go and you subscribe to the most recent publication for that particular industry. So now you know the newest and you got the basics. And then he's like, the reason for having all that is now you are smart enough to ask questions. And so the rest of the way is get a mentor. Find somebody who knows what they're doing and let them teach you how to walk through it.
Yeah.
But nobody wants to take someone from 0 to 100. You got to get you need the inertia. You have to have put the work in to get from 0 to 1. I'll take you from 2 to 99 or 2 to, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I can't do 0 to 0 to 1 is the hardest, most energy to spend possible. And everybody knows some friend that is like a log. And I'm not speaking to these notions of like keeping out folks who might be like depressed or in a situation like that, but just actually like a generically lazy, like you can't get from 0. Like I can't take you here. People who come to you and they're like, man, I want to do what you do. And they can't conceive that they are in control of a number of things that could get them that much closer to being where they think you are, you know? And that, once he gave me that, it's been tremendously true because it's one of those things that even if you want to change your career, it's just important to do. Like, all right, let me go get the basics. Let me go get the newest. Now I'm going to start some conversations. And then you find you're smart enough to impress somebody who knows how to open a door for you.
And it makes it more compelling for the mentor to say, oh, this younger person has taken the initiative to learn, and is curious, and then that is whether you're kind of off to the races because it's a partnership from there.
Exactly. I will fill you. I will fill the cup now because I see that you're seeking knowledge. It's that thing. It's the proverb that is probably one of my favorite proverbs. I have, for anybody who knows me will kind of tell you that I speak in this kind of like proverbs, cliches and shit. I'm into it. So I believe it's an African proverb, but don't quote me there. The one where they say, he who does not know and who does not know that he does not know is a fool. Avoid him. He who does not know and knows that he does not know is a student. Teach him. He who knows and does not know that he knows is asleep. Wake him up. And he who knows and knows that he knows is wise. Follow him. Dude.
Cool.
And every one of us is in some version of that.
Yeah.
Some of those moments, I'm like, shit, I'm asleep. Like I know I'm asleep, or I know I'm a student. I know I'm a fool.
Right.
But this one, listen to me on this one.
Yeah. Well, I was gonna say you could drift between each of those phases.
And
any day of the week.
Any day of the week, and I just like those kinds of things. Keep me.
Love it.
Yeah, they keep me in the right space to acknowledge what I'm in control of and what I'm not in control of. Because that's, I think, the hardest thing about like having a job, keeping a job, being a reasonable human being in the world with other people around you is like, what am I messing up so that I can at least control that and then see what's happening.
Yeah.
Otherwise.
Amen. I mean, that's the work. That's the attentiveness required.
Period. To me, if you make podcasts and you care about somebody listening to what you say, or you usher in somebody else's story, you need some considerable amount of self-awareness.
Yeah. I mean, podcast aside, that'll do anybody.
Yeah, fair.
Anybody well. Well, thanks again for being on the show. This has been really fun.
Thanks, man. This is great. I really appreciate this. We should do this again.
That's it for this episode. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Thanks, Aaron Mason and Caitlin Watkins, for your contributions to this episode. Thanks as well to A Nave Especial for the music. This is Ty, your host. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll catch you soon with more episodes of the Jalapeno Podcast. Take care.